Hi, I'm Brittney Ashley, your host of Breaking Norms, Building Dreams, your guide through this transformative journey in both business and life. This is your place crafted for dreamers, doers, or anyone who has been told they can't. Get ready as we challenge those narratives together. You're tuning in live to the United Public Radio Network, airing on 105.3 and 107.7 FM in New Orleans. We are streaming on all the popular platforms every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Join me for a candid and thought-provoking conversation celebrating your unique journey because you are worth it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breaking Norms, Building Dreams. I'm your host, Brittney Ashley, and I'm so excited to have Kendall back today. Thank you for coming back on the show, Kendall.
Thanks so much for having me again.
Yeah, thank you. And if you don't know, we are on the United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM in New Orleans. Get ready to escape the next hour as we break norms and build dreams today with Kendall. I'm so excited for you to be back on the show because today we're talking about ADHD in adults.
Yes.
Last time you were here, we were talking about kiddos with ADHD and how to parent with them. And this time we get to talk a little bit more about us adults living with it and all of the other things that we can really talk about and talk about your tools and kits and all the things. I'm really excited for today.
I'm excited. Yeah, this is going to be fun.
So everyone listening, please put in your questions, comments to Kendall and I will make sure we address them.
Mm-hmm.
But just for a quick little short bio on Kendall, Kendall has ADHD and is an ADHD Certificate Educator. She loves and supports those with ADHD and those people who love and support them. She is the founder of the ADHD Toolkit and lives in Calgary, Canada with her neurodivergent family. Thank you again for coming on us, your background and how you started.
Yeah. I was not diagnosed with ADHD until 24, so I'm considered a late diagnosis, although not nearly as late as many of the people that I work with. I work with people right now in the test group for my adult course. I have people everywhere from 27 to 60 years old.
Oh, wow.
And most of them are recently diagnosed, which is it's super cool. But I grew up in a very neurodivergent family. My sister was diagnosed in childhood, and so I knew a bit about ADHD, and there were some things that hit with me, but I didn't struggle in the same way.
Yeah.
And I made it work. And I did it well. Yes. And it wasn't until the demand on my executive function system exceeded my capacity. Essentially, once I became a teacher and had to manage my own executive dysfunction as well as that of a bunch of children, it became way too much for my brain to handle. And so that's when I sought diagnosis. I taught in the classroom for 8 years. I taught fourth grade my entire career. Loved it. Best grade ever, in my personal opinion. I've taken it 9 times personally, but I love teaching. It was an amazing career, is an amazing season of my life. But the demands of having a daughter with some medical needs, as well as just wanting to lean into supporting my family, led me down a different road. And that's what led me to support people with ADHD and the people who love and support them.
I love that. Yeah. And then your website or your toolkit, maybe you can just highlight again about the toolkits and what.
Yeah, for sure. So currently I have a course. It's a 15-week digital course. So 12 weeks of content spread out over 15 weeks because life happens, illness happens, vacation happens, But it's a deep dive into everything ADHD, understanding what's actually going on in the brain. Why do we struggle with the things we struggle with? ADHD is far more complex than most people realize because the diagnostic criteria really don't do the condition justice. So we do a deep dive into everything ADHD and how do we support that in a way that's neurodivergent affirming? How do we work with our brain instead of fighting our brain? Because neurotypical strategies, the strategies that the general population use, often don't work with our brain because we have a different neurology. Our brain is structured different physically and it functions different. So we need different tools.
Yes. And I love that. Let's just hit on that a little bit harder because I find just in the general scheme of going into the school system, it's still just a little bit old school. It doesn't even matter even if you're going in with your kiddos, but even as an adult, like I struggled so much in university, college, and just even like the support system still isn't there where I think it should be.
Yeah.
And even though, yes, we have now more advocates talking about ADHD, dyslexia, or whichever, I still find that unfortunately there's still that stigma. There's still that kind of not that support that really wants to help us fully, or there's a lot of pushback. And I get that we need to do the different kind of psychology testing and all of that. But I would like to see more of a change of that dynamic across the full fields. I think with kiddos in elementary, I'm seeing a lot more support than it was versus the college years, I would like to say.
Mhm.
Just because I just finished my coaching certificate not too long ago. So I just feel like I've been through that transition already.
Yeah.
But with that, maybe we can kind of talk a little bit about how ADHD differs in adults, because I know you've touched on it a little bit, but maybe we can dig a little bit deeper there, because
Mhm.
what I experienced, but you might have it, and I'm self-diagnosed. Let's just say there, but
That's great.
I'll get there one day after the kids get all their.
There you go. Yeah, it's a little frustrating that the process to get the diagnosis requires an incredible amount of executive function, right?
Mhm.
Exactly what we struggle with.
Yeah,
It requires time awareness, it requires planning and prioritizing, it requires doing all these things that we struggle with to get the diagnosis that we struggle with these things.
exactly. And
It's a
then I
bit
get
of a messy system.
overwhelmed and shut down, and that's probably why I never gone through with my own process, just because I'm
Mhm.
just trying to get the kids in alignment too, to make sure they're okay for school.
Totally.
I'm like,
Yeah,
I've already been there, done that.
and I think at some stage, self-diagnosis is completely valid and a great stepping stone. I don't think that's where we should land. Now, I talk to people who are like, "Yeah, I'm in my 50s, I'm self-diagnosed. What's the point in getting a diagnosis now?" And I understand that perspective.
Yeah.
But I think that there is such benefit in getting the information to learn about our brain.
Mhm.
Anytime you can learn more about how you work and how to work with your own brain, that's a win. And that's why I encourage people to pursue diagnosis, regardless of whether you want to go down the medication route or not.
Mm.
The the confirmation that yes, this is a valid experience, that what you're struggling with isn't just you sucking at adulting,
Yeah.
that there is structural
Yep.
differences in your brain and that make society, as our society is set up, more challenging for you.
Mhm.
And I think there is I'm a little bit of a weird one. When people tell me that they're diagnosed, I celebrate. Yes, congratulations, that's awesome. And it seems like a weird thing, like, oh, you've just been told that your brain works differently and life is hard for you. Why are you celebrating that? But the reality is, I'm celebrating that you understand more about yourself, and that is such a win. So
Love that.
that's my little rant on self-diagnosis. But it's valid. It's a great stepping stone.
Mhm.
Eventually, I really encourage official diagnosis. So but
Yes.
I also recognize that that's not easily accessible to many people in the world, so there's also that.
It seems to be a little bit more accessible nowadays. There's
Depends where
different.
you are in the world.
Yeah, does it?
Yeah, there are, like, generally in the UK, it's about a 3,
Oh,
sometimes 4-year wait to get
okay.
to a diagnosing psychiatrist. It's yeah, we are quite fortunate in Canada and the US to have many more options for diagnosis, and
Mhm.
that's not necessarily the case around the world. So, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it definitely is easier now here, though, for
Yeah,
sure.
because
Yeah.
the like, just even online that you can go and just to fill out. How do you feel about those places that I know it's kind of kids.
There's yeah, there's a big controversy right now with one organization from the US that did, online diagnosis. Um, and from what I heard, because I was actually in the process of preparing to contact the company and interview them so that I could feel good about advocating for them,
Mhm,
if that's what I chose to do. Because I do advocate for a couple of organizations here in Canada,
mhm,
that do the virtual diagnosis. I There is the possibility that these organizations can push diagnosis simply for the income. And
Gotcha.
that's scary.
Mhm.
And so I think it's really important to look at who's behind the company
Yeah.
and um, what their like rate of refusal is when they turn people away.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think that's an element as well as what process are they diagnosing? The nice thing about this is generally those clinics specialize in ADHD. So one of the virtual clinics here in Canada, um, their organization is primarily focused on ADHD, primarily adult ADHD. They don't diagnose kids. And I think that that's beautiful in that, as we initially talked about,
Mhm.
um, the uh, adults do present differently. I often hear, "Oh, yeah, women don't have the hyperactive component." That's not true.
Mhm.
It's just internalized hyperactivity for the vast majority of us.
Mhm.
And so we may not present in the traditional ways. So, yeah. So it is nice to have people who specialize in this because I have also worked with somebody recently who had a psychiatrist tell them that they couldn't possibly have ADHD because they didn't struggle in school. And
Mhm.
that's not that's not a diagnostic criteria anywhere. That's old information that is well out of date. And so
Yeah.
that's frustrating when you're accessing providers and waiting and going through this whole process only to be told something that's not accurate. So
So,
tricky.
yes. Yeah. It's good to know though for anyone listening. Just like do your research. Just because I've heard of others here in Canada, specifically in BC, use certain places, and you end up paying some of this money, and then sometimes it yeah. I don't know. I guess if you can get in to see a doctor, try to go in that route and go in the proper procedure way. But if you're going online, do extra research and really ask curious questions to make sure they're actually a legit company versus just
Mm,
somebody who's just created a business to make the income.
yeah,
That's the unfortunate thing with online businesses that you might never know of when you're just searching things. It's good to do your research.
totally. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but
Well,
we kind of segued a little bit.
we
What
did
differs?
classic ADHD moments. It's what we do.
ADHD among us.
Cheers.
It's so funny.
Yeah.
It's
So
trying to focus on that one.
yeah. So getting back to the idea of how does adult ADHD differ?
Mhm,
Generally, it's quite interesting. Initially, ADHD was called hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. It was only viewed as a childhood event, and then you grew out of it. And
mhm,
then there was this idea that maybe some people don't grow out of it. What we're learning now is that no, this is structural differences in the brain and differences in the way that we have access to dopamine in the brain. And
mhm,
that doesn't go away. What can happen is that we may learn tools and strategies that takes us from just above a diagnostic level to just below. So we're subclinical. And so we might be able to manage it better. And that may take us below the diagnostic level.
mhm,
And so that would be considered, you'd grow out of it, but you don't. It
mhm.
just changes. What really is often happening is those really outward symptoms like hyperactivity. And you think about the 8-year-old boy that the criteria were based on, who climbs all over and can't sit still in their chair and is wandering the classroom and is jumping on the couches, right? That's what we think of when we think hyperactivity. And what happens is as we grow, that hyperactivity goes from externalized to internalized.
Mhm.
And so we don't see adults who are jumping on couches and getting up out of their seat when they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
What we do see is we see adults who feel extraordinarily anxious and like they always need to be doing something and they can't sit and watch a movie without also folding laundry or also scrolling on their phone or also doing something else. And that's just internalized hyperactivity. So we go from an externalized presentation to more of an internalized presentation. This is also why girls tend to be diagnosed later because we have an internalized presentation.
Mm.
Now, generally, for men, we see this trend where we go from very externalized to more internalized. We see a little bit of growth in things like impulsivity and a little bit of growth in emotional regulation. And so it seems to get better for a lot of men, or at least more manageable.
Mhm.
Women go through a very different process because of hormones.
Yes.
Girls are relatively stable, and then our cycle shows up, and that causes chaos because dopamine follows estrogen. So every month when our estrogen drops, so does our dopamine levels. So women actually experience teenage girls and women experience great variability. Is that the right way?
Yes.
Words. Um, Changes in our ADHD presentation throughout the month, every
Mhm.
month.
Okay.
And so many women report that school wasn't so bad and then it got worse. And so we see the opposite from what we see from men, where we see more regulation and it tends to get a bit easier to manage. A lot of women say it gets harder to manage, which is why we have this
Mhm.
influx of women. And then perimenopause hits and
Of
menopause and estrogen crashes, and we go through it all over again. This is another big moment where we have women going, I was coping the majority of my life, and suddenly I have no estrogen, so I have no accessible dopamine, and what is this?
Mhm.
And so life gets harder for women. Another major moment in many women's life cycle where ADHD is exacerbated is once we've had a baby,
I was
because
just
estrogen,
gonna ask.
yep, estrogen level goes high. I actually found that some of my ADHD traits were lessened during pregnancy,
Mm.
although all my friends who were pregnant were like, "Oh, the brain fog." Like, I'm like, "Welcome to my day-to-day, people. Like, this is just life." Yeah, you left you left something in the fridge. I could count on 2 hands how many times I've done that in the last week. My phone is often in the fridge. I put it down there without thinking, and I forget it, and then I have to go hunting for it. Thank goodness for Find My
Yeah.
Phone.
Yes.
It and so, um, but after I had kids, it was incredible how intense my symptoms came on.
Mm.
And so that is a dramatic difference as well, is this seasons where, ADHD for women gets significantly worse.
Mhm. It's funny that you mentioned that because I was actually gonna ask that because I felt with my daughter, everything was okay, but after my second, with my son, it just and, like, even the more or less this year, I just feel like it's, like, on another level, and that's why I was even thinking, "Okay, maybe I should go get diagnosed." Even my friend, if he's listening, he's an ongoing joke that we're, besties to try to get, like, the 2 for 1 deal of ADHD diagnosis. I was trying to go into his doctor's office, like, "If he gets some medication, can I jump on that train?"
Oh, goodness.
But just because he had a doctor and I don't, so I'm just kinda just sitting here waiting.
Mhm.
But the I just yeah, this year, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's, like, also the age switch too, like, I don't know, because I know it takes a while for you to kind of change your hormones after your your other kid as well, because you're back-to-back kids, your hormones are constantly changing back and forth. I don't
Mhm.
know. So I definitely seen like an increase in me this year where it was like almost a level of like burnout too.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, and here's the scary thing. So, we know classically in medicine, women are not studied. It's infuriating. It's a thing. Um, it was recently brought to my attention that the first study that we can find
mhm,
that looked at women's hormones and ADHD and how those fit together was done in 2017.
that's crazy.
One of the major medications for adults, Vyvanse, when it was studied for adults, it was only studied on men.
Hmm.
I believe it was approved in the 2000s. It's research into
Mhm.
women and ADHD is severely lacking. There currently is, from what I've been able to find, there is no real research done onto how do we support women with ADHD in menopause. And it's a big
Mm,
issue. It's a really significant issue. So, this is an area that we desperately need more research into because we know that hormones impact ADHD.
mhm.
We know that perimenopause and menopause has a significant effect on ADHD, and it's not being studied. and this is problematic.
And even just kind of going back to the late diagnosis for girls, women, um, it's sad. Like I just did some testing through with my son. If you're listening, prior when I was talking with Marianne, I took him in to get his autism testing. And so I kind of poked the psychologist's brain just a little bit after that. Just I'm like, well, you're here anyways. It kind of already paid services. So I'm just going to ask you some extra questions. But I asked him specifically on girls for ADHD and like what to look for and all these things. And even for my son too, if that is hereditary or whichever. And it's funny because he ended up talking a lot more about my son, which is fine because we were there more for my son anyways.
Mhm.
And it just seemed like there was not very much of the input for like what to watch out for girls or even
Mhm. And girls are harder to diagnose because for a number of factors. One, girls are much more socially aware of social cues, social expectations. And
women.
so girls are much better at masking than boys are generally. These are all very much generalizations. There are men who are extraordinary maskers, and are late diagnosed because of that, or high achievers, that kind of stuff. But so just side note, I am not being entirely binary about this. I'm talking about generalizations.
Yeah.
Um, Generally, girls are much more aware of social expectations,
Mhm.
and because of that, they internalize and they mask symptoms a lot more
Yeah.
than boys generally do. And so that's one of the tricks. The other factor is girls generally have social structures that support them.
Mhm.
Goodness gracious, the number of times that my friends helped me clean out lockers, they offered to study with me, they offered to help me with homework. They came and supported me, which masked my ADHD.
Mhm.
Boys generally do not have that same structure. Instead of, "Hey, remember to study for that test," or "Do you wanna study for that test together?" It's, "Hey, how
Mhm.
did you do on that test?" And my husband and I were talking about this, and he was going, "Yeah, like, I never had anybody warning me or offering to help me. They were just asking me about that test that I totally forgot, and then I skipped." So, in that way, it's also harder to catch us because we do support each other, and that causes us to mask a lot of our symptoms.
Mhm.
If we do have a good set of friends who are willing to support us and cover us.
Mhm.
So that's a factor, as well. I have had to go hunting for
Mhm.
people um, to find clinicians who would do more of an interview style, recognizing that our current set of diagnostic criteria are insufficient for internalized presentation amongst girls. And
Mhm.
if we're just looking at the forms, the number of forms that you fill out, same thing for adults, it misses a lot of us because
Mhm.
we're not 8-year-old boys. We don't present as bounce off the wall 8-year-old boys, right? And so, if you are pursuing assessment for yourself or for a child who you believe may have ADHD, a more internalized form, you're going to want to look for somebody who does more of an interview style, who does more watching behavior or looking like observation in the classroom, even perhaps, or um, interviews with you and your partner or spouse or a coworker or somebody who sees you operating, because we don't necessarily fit the traditional mold.
Mhm.
And many researchers are calling for a complete rewrite of the diagnostic criteria
Mhm.
in the DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, the Bible for diagnosing anything neuro, mental health wise. In North America, there's another similar text used more so in Europe, but in the DSM, emotional dysregulation is not anywhere in our diagnostic criteria. But we know from research that emotional dysregulation is one of the core features of ADHD. Our highs
Mhm.
are really high, our lows are really low, and we move really fast in
Mhm.
those. So it's
Mhm.
not like a mood disorder where the mood isn't doesn't match the situation or comes out of nowhere. ADHD moods, ADHD emotions are, they make sense to the situation, they're just extreme. So,
Mhm.
whereas a neurotypical person might feel frustrated about something, I might feel angry. And where they may perceive the situation and have a moment to kind of process it and figure out what's going on, my emotions just hit. But they make sense. They're triggered by something. They make sense. They're just extreme.
Mm-hmm. Would you say with the increased diagnosis now that we're seeing, would you put that more in correlation that because everybody's talking on it on TikTok or social media, or it's just more an open conversation now?
That's a component of it, certainly. I think there was a huge increase in particularly adult women being diagnosed in the last handful of years. Number one, because we're finally researching women with ADHD. Goodness gracious, 2017 isn't that long ago when we're looking at hormones and how they impact ADHD. So number one, we're finally being researched. Number two, the pandemic was really hard on those of us with ADHD. Think about the structures that existed in the workplace that enabled people with ADHD, whether that be the social structures or there's just the structure of going to work for your brain. And then that was all removed. And suddenly we struggled more and more because we didn't have these structures that we relied on to manage our ADHD. So that was a component. A huge component was the discussion on social media and the rise of that, both for benefit and for downfall. There's a ton of misinformation on ADHD on social media that's highly concerning, either leading to overdiagnosis of people who have other things that may be an issue. There are many other things that can mimic ADHD type symptoms, whether that is a vision issue, a hearing issue, a level of different chemicals or whatever in the body. Low iron anemia can in a lot of ways mimic ADHD with brain fog and exhaustion and some of those factors. So there's a lot of things that should be checked, but may not be because of social media's influence. And then there's a lot of things that are being tied into ADHD that just aren't. The whole like dinosaur arm thing that's gone on about like how this is a sign of neurodivergence if you keep your hands here, if you sleep with your hands tucked in. It's not true. It's a correlation, but also a lot of neurotypical people also do that. So like, is that a sign you have ADHD? No.
Yeah.
So, in that way, there's both benefit and downfall, as with everything social media.
Well,
And
that's
being mindful about who you're getting information from and confirming that with people who have a background in understanding research and being able to look into that. I did a series on social media on ADHD medication. And one of the big things that people asked about was, hey, there's this study that came out that showed huge increased risk in cardiac conditions with ADHD stimulants. And if you actually look into the research, the research wasn't the one study that everybody was panicking about. It wasn't a fantastically structured study, and it didn't account for the fact that those of us with ADHD already have an increased cardiac risk, which was almost no different than what their results were producing. So they weren't controlling for things like that. And there are much better studies that show that there really is very little risk. So.
Yeah. Well, and then it just kind of goes back to the whole beginning of the conversation too, is do your research.
Yeah.
Because with social media, we have access to it endlessly. And so just because you see somebody talking about it, just take another look at their credentials and also to their background and maybe ask them more questions, and then ask your friends if they've ever heard of the person and so forth. Or Facebook groups are really great because I find you just go in one Facebook group and ask, there's somebody that can give some kind of feedback.
And there's a lot of people who prey on people with ADHD to take our money, frankly, because it is really hard. And we do want solutions. We want our lives to be easier. We live life on hard mode. We don't have to. We don't want to. And I get that. But there are a lot of people who propose cures or they will fix you. Well, you don't need to be fixed. Your brain isn't broken. It just works differently. The whole neurotypical world work like a Windows operating system, and we are functioning on a Mac system. It's our brain is just on a different system. It's not bad. It's not broken. It just needs different tools and supports. And I get very angry when I see a lot of these stuff out there that research has either disproven or that has no proven research behind it that claims to
Mm.
fix us. I don't need to be fixed. I don't want to be fixed. There are beautiful parts of my ADHD brain that I wouldn't want to remove, even if somebody could wave a magic wand and take it all away. I wouldn't want that. Because I
Exactly.
love my brain.
We'll step into like the 9 to 5 life a little bit. So, but
Mhm.
we're already on the midway point for everybody listening. Welcome to Breaking Norms, Building Dreams. You are listening to United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network on 105.3 and 107.7 FM in New Orleans, which I kind of want to segue a little bit into, like, for me anyways, the 9 to 5 journey didn't sit well, which I always thought that I should go that route, you know? But
Mhm.
luckily had my kiddo and then never looked back and just been living life on the non 9 to 5 realm. And it makes sense now because I get bored so fast. So I used to work in the tech industry, and like once I learned something, I'm like on to the next. Or, okay, I did this now. What else? Like I'm just sitting here. I learned something. Someone educate me. Like,
Yeah.
and I think people would just get annoyed or be constantly doing something very fast. So I had like a few different kind of positions in my life. I would say like I was kind of like a hippie in different roles. But if I learned something really fast, I'm like, okay, done. And then I would sometimes be like done the role or outline that was asked of me and asking for the next role, which would then be kind of considered like the supervisor role. And then I wasn't like because it looked like I was gunning for their job, but it wasn't. It's just because I'm so bored
Mhm.
and I just need that like that dopamine hit in a way of like exciting things and learning new things and okay, on to the next.
Yeah. Our brain, the ADHD brain is driven by novelty. We
Yeah.
love new, we love novel, we love fun, and then we also thrive on emotional stimulation, positive or negative, which, side note, is why many of us with ADHD tend to just pick fights with people because it's an easy source of dopamine and it's negative emotional
Yeah.
stimulation. So if you see a child with ADHD who's pestering their sibling out of nowhere, they just need dopamine. Point them to a healthier source of dopamine. Same thing with adults. Our my husband and my marriage therapist, amazing. He's got special training in ADHD, and one of the things he challenged us with was like, okay, so which of you, or maybe both, get emotional stimulation out of arguing? Because it's a common thing. And it's not bad, it's not wrong. We just need to find healthier ways to engage in dopamining, trying to find some dopamine.
Mhm.
Um, so that was a little side note. Those of us with ADHD are 3 times more likely to be entrepreneurs. This is A, because sometimes we suck at being employees. We struggle with time blindness, we're impulsive, we're emotional. There's many reasons. But 2, because we are creative problem solvers and we like to find ways to do things differently. And we have
Mhm.
very creative ideas and we're willing to take the risk. And that's incredible. We make very good entrepreneurs in many cases if we can spend the majority of our time in our strength zone. Uh,
Mhm.
and many of us thrive in this entrepreneur world. That's not to say that everybody with ADHD is a terrible employee. That's not true. It's finding an environment that works with our brain.
Mhm.
And oftentimes that is a role where we're going to be able to take on new projects, new things, learn new things where we're not getting bored, where we
Mhm.
can conquer this mountain and it's on to the next one. Those roles often we do really, really well, or where we can engage in our job and engage in something really stimulating mentally. So a job where we can be moving a lot and listening to a really cool podcast while we're doing our job. That's
Mhm.
often a great role for us. The other thing is having flexibility with things like time, where very strict structured time, for those of us with time blindness can be very, very challenging. And so having a place that doesn't really care kind of when you start and when you end your workday, so long as you're getting your work done, is going to be a much healthier, much more successful environment for us as employees
Mhm.
instead of this rigid, it is show up, you have to check in at this minute on the dot and XYZ. We don't tend to do well with that.
No. I feel like I like to challenge it. Like I like to be like on time, but the thing is it's like I just like, I'll do it on my terms because, I told myself that I'll do it, not because you told me to do it.
Yeah. So many of us with ADHD also experience demand avoidance, and this is another challenge with work, is that when there's a sense of demand on us,
Mhm.
our nervous system, this is a system reaction, it's not a personality issue, but our nervous system sees that as an infringement on our autonomy. And we all want autonomy. We all want to have a sense of control over our own lives. And
Mhm.
so when there's demands from bosses or expectations that feel like demands, our nervous system goes into fight, flight, freeze, and we push back.
Mhm.
Another reason that sometimes we suck at being employees. But if we have really good managers who understand this and can um, have a good relationship with us and can understand how to communicate well, that doesn't have to be a problem.
Yeah. Do you, for anyone that is a manager listening or whichever in that kind of role, working with those with ADHD, do you have any kind of tips and tricks for them to kind
Yeah.
of follow or think about? Even if like you might not even know that your team members have ADHD, but maybe just some things for them to kind of think of to walk away with.
Yeah. I think one thing is communication. How are we communicating with each other in a way that the other people are going to hear? And I think that's a trait of a really good manager is somebody who reaches out and goes, "Hey, how can I best communicate with you in a way that you will hear and receive well?" Because oftentimes people react poorly not because um, the core issue
Mhm.
with, whatever you're asking me to do is the issue. It's that, you're placing a demand on me and my nervous system panics about that. Or I get overwhelmed by what you're asking me, or the way you ask me triggers my rejection sensitivity. And
Mhm.
if managers can learn how to communicate well with each person, and same thing with neurotypical people,
Mhm.
um, in a way that will be received well, that creates such a healthy environment.
Mhm.
Um, so that's one thing I think is just asking each of the people that you manage, "How can I communicate well with you?
Mhm.
How do you like to hear feedback? How can I best give you feedback on your work? Do you want to hear that in person so you can clarify intent? Would you like me to get that on do you want it in an email? Like, how can we communicate well so that we can hear each other?" I
I
think
love.
yeah. Secondly, we thrive under structure, but we really hate it. We need deadlines. We need structure, enough structure that we can set up our systems on it, our
Mhm.
own systems. If you micromanage me, I'm going to lose it because that's too much for me and your systems probably won't work for mine. But if I have no deadlines, then there's no internal pressure for me to get things done, which makes it very hard to motivate my brain. So
Mhm.
I need broad structures with which I can hang my strategies on
Mhm.
to function well. So
Yes.
flexibility within structure, if that makes sense.
I love that. I definitely can see those as all positives to kind of take away for anybody working with ADHD or non ADHD, because I feel like as a manager myself, working with a team of it fluctuates between 5 to 10 ladies on a month time frame, and each one works differently. And I don't even consider myself a manager because I feel like we make this company. It's not just a me situation. And so I bring that into my conversations of how can we make sure that this makes sense for you? What can I do to help you to make that be that support person? What does the deadlines, like talking about deadlines, we have a few that do have ADHD on the team. And so I really work with them like what makes sense. Like I don't like to micromanage because
Mhm.
I don't like to be micromanaged, nor I feel like if they
Nobody does well under micromanaging.
no, exactly. I feel like you're going to get so much more of an organic, streamlined team when they see that you don't need to micromanage them. It's that trust level.
Yeah, when you trust our people, and I think about Dr. Barkley, who's has been one of the leading researchers in the field of ADHD. He talks about an accommodation for school. Generally, we give kids with ADHD extra time. This is
Mhm.
a silly idea. It doesn't work. Why? Because if you give somebody with time blindness more time,
Mhm.
hurrah, it's like waiting for Christmas to come. It's awful. It's miserable. It's a terrible experience. Instead, he suggests something called time off the clock, where
Mm.
if everybody gets an hour, if the neurotypical kids get an hour for this exam, I get an hour too. The difference is I have a stopwatch. And at any time, I can stop the stopwatch, get up, and take a break. And when I'm ready, I can go back to my work and start the timer. And it's that flexibility within structure, right? It
Hmm.
is, you need a break at this moment, 5 minutes after you just took a break, fine. You still only get an hour of actual intentional exam time,
Yeah.
but you have flexibility, and that gives autonomy, and it gives us a chance to work with our own brain. And I think that's really important. The other really big thing that I will throw out for any managers: stop expecting immediate responses. The
Yeah.
reason for this is manyfold. Um, I was working with somebody just over social media quite a while ago who was really struggling at their employment with the tone of the messages they were sending, with their responses. They were struggling with feeling rejected, which is an element of emotional dysregulation for us. Is our brain can misinterpret and misperceive communication as rejection, and it's extraordinarily painful. Anyways, so all these things were factoring into them getting into a lot of trouble in work. And so we devised a strategy where communication was primarily done over email, not face to face. So there was a moment of pause. We could manage impulsivity in that moment. And then I gave this person access to some tools that they could run their messaging through to change or check for tone and intent.
Mhm.
And and then improve their communication. It reduced the moment of, I have to have an answer right now. It allowed them time to process in their brain. It helped them manage their emotional dysregulation when they felt like they were being attacked, even if they weren't. They could use their strategies instead of having to have an answer immediately face to face. It allowed them to use tools to ensure that the intent and the tone of their messaging was what they were trying to do, and then send it off. And that structure didn't take very long to implement. Didn't take much time, except for meetings got changed to emails instead of face-to-face meetings. That's not a bad thing for everybody. And completely changed the way they operated at work, and went from struggling and being called into HR for negative reasons to being celebrated by HR for showing significant improvement at work.
Yeah.
Not a significant change, but it made a huge difference in this person's world. And
Mhm.
they could continue contributing really well to this organization that they were doing great work for.
I love that. And that's like, for anyone listening, I think it's always the take a moment, take a breath back, and try to like think of other ways around a situation. I always think that there's ways to solve something. It's always a matter of communication. So we're just like going through a situation right now, and I'm kind of in like the group chat, and I just do not like how the tone is coming across with the client to us of, here's the project, is it done now? I'm like, You literally sent it at 5 o'clock at night. We're not employees, because that's the thing. As virtual assistants or online business managers, we are not employees. We create our own hours. We've communicated to you multiple times. And so like all my like red flags, I'm like, red flag, red flag. But the thing is, it doesn't even matter for VAs or OBMs, even when you're working within that kind of setting within a 9 to 5. Just thinking about kind of the tone, like you're talking about, the way how you can present maybe a certain situation. Maybe you don't know how to present it, and just be transparent about it. This is a tough situation to talk about. I'm not sure what way to angle it, but this is where we're at. I would like to end here. Where, like, I feel like, unfortunately, when you get into that higher level of management dictatorship, I feel like sometimes people forget that we're people.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, I think one of the beautiful things about emotional dysregulation as part of ADHD is yes, we struggle with big anger, we struggle with big frustration and big shame and big sadness and all of these big hard emotions, but we also have really big empathy, and we have really big compassion and really big love and really big all the beautiful emotions too. And
mhm,
that experience of rejection sensitivity on our end, as well as just these really big feelings, empower us to be incredibly kind and incredibly empathetic and incredibly compassionate. And so we do highly monitor our tone. We are often overly worried about how our message is going to be perceived. And that really can be a beautiful thing if we are in an environment where we're encouraged to be able to use that,
Mhm.
where we
Yeah.
can take that pause instead of reacting emotionally because you're in front of me and I have to give you an answer now and my brain's not processing and all I'm doing is thinking about this really big feeling that I'm suddenly having because it feels like you're rejecting me and I know you're not cognitively, but my emotions are telling you, right? Like we just go on the spiral.
Spiral.
Whereas if I get that in an email, I can go, okay, I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to pause. I'm going to use my tools and then I can engage in a way that goes, hey, here's what
Mhm.
I'm hearing. Do you mind clarifying what you're saying? Is this your intent?
Mhm.
Because I've had a moment to process that.
Exactly. With I just wanna kinda tap into the tools, like, is there any technology or anything that you can recommend adults to utilize?
Yeah. So one of the tools that I gave in that specific situation is called Goblin Tools. It is free, both available in an app. I'm just pulling it up right now. So I have the accurate link. It's free, both online. So goblin.tools. And they have a bunch of, it's created for ADHD brains. They have a bunch of different tools, all for free, some using AI. So
Okay.
they have, it's called the Magic To Do, where it breaks things down so you don't have to, which is amazing. It's like a to-do list where instead of you having to figure out all the steps of it, it will break it down for you, which is lovely. They have a formalizer, they call it, and
Uh-huh.
that is, they have the subtitle is Turn the Spicy Thoughts into Classy Ones or vice versa. Um,
Um,
so that helps rewrite your text for your tone. Then it has a tool called the Judge. Am I misreading the tone of this? So we can put that in and check our tone of our writing, or
okay.
if we're getting a piece of writing from our boss and our brain is interpreting it as attacking us, we can put it in
Mhm.
there and it'll help us clarify what the tone actually is
Oh,
instead
neat.
of what our brain might be spinning.
Yeah.
It has the professor, which is give me the crash course. And so
Neat.
you ask for a topic and it'll run it down for you, which is a newer one. That one's really cool. Speaking of time blindness, they have the estimator, which is just tell me how long this is probably going to take
Oh,
for
neat.
those of us who struggle with figuring out how long things are going to take. And then they have the compiler, which is essentially a brain dump, which turns it into a to-do list. And then Chef is the last tool, which you can input whatever ingredients you have in your fridge or in your pantry, press a button, and it'll recommend some things you can make with those things, which is really
That's
nice. So
neat. That's
it's
awesome.
yeah, it's a free, fabulous tool with lots of different pieces to it. I really like that.
That's like, I use the chat bot a lot because I have it, like, all in my brain, and I'm like, "Yes, but how do I put it down on paper?"
Yeah,
And just, like, also, like, I struggle with my grammar and all the things, link back to dyslexia a little bit too, and so it's nice to use these programs because I feel like it's, like, such a savior. Like, it's my assistant, but then it's like, "No, you get me." Sometimes, obviously, it doesn't always get you.
yeah, yeah.
Get
I
a little
saw some
sometimes.
I saw somebody on social media talk about how they use ChatGPT when
Mhm.
they're overwhelmed or when they're stuck, and they just talk at ChatGPT about all their issues,
Yes.
and then say, "Can you please summarize what I've said with the top 3 things that are in my way?" Or whatever, and it can, I mean, not always accurately, it's still AI, but, it can help kinda synthesize all the chaos in our brain and all these things. Part of our struggle is we see all the connections between all these things. So things that are probably a bit more straightforward than we think, we see too many connections in, and it makes it really complex in our brain,
Yeah.
along with struggles with planning and prioritizing and organizing and all these other factors. So we can utilize technology to do some of that work for us where we struggle.
Yeah, I love that. I It seriously has been, like, such a lifesaver for me. Like, I feel like I'm, like, doing able to do, like, 3 times the work in a day sometimes when I actually
Mhm.
utilize it because I sit there and just, like, review my emails multiple times, like, "Does this make sense? Or is my tone not good?" Like, "Oh my goodness, I hope this is good."
Yeah.
The vicious cycle.
It is. And it's helpful to have tools and recognizing that it's not a failure to utilize these tools. It's an
Mhm.
accommodation.
Exactly.
And accommodations aren't bad things. It doesn't mean we failed at being an adult. It means that this world, the society is not structured for our brain, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yes.
one of my favorite examples of this is the classic advice out there. I think some people call it the eat the frog strategy, whatever. But one
Mhm.
of the big productivity strategies is do the hardest thing first. Great advice for neurotypicals, terrible advice for ADHD brains. Because we need an on-ramp. The best
Yeah.
thing we can do is choose the easiest thing to do first, and then use that as a ramp to get into more complicated, more challenging things.
Mhm.
So, that's where this a lot of the advice, a lot of the productivity, a lot of the workplace setup isn't structured for our brain. When you understand the neurology, the actual chemical component of what's going on in our brain to, um, to start tasks, to create motivation, it works differently for us. So, of
Mhm.
course, we would have different tools. Of course, we would need to access different tools to allow us to function. It's like, if somebody does not have the use of their legs, that's not a moral failing to use a wheelchair.
Yeah.
It's just a
Oh.
valid tool that allows them to access the world that isn't built for people who don't have the same mobility. It's
Mhm.
the same thing. It's just because it's neurological, people see it as more of a moral failing. And a lot of our ADHD traits are perceived as moral failings in our society, right? Being on time, that's perceived as a moral virtue. It's not, it's a cultural virtue, but um,
Mhm.
because we perceive time differently, and because of that, we are often late. We're seen as lazy, we're seen as disrespectful, all these
Mhm.
things. And that's not true because we forget things because of struggles with attention and working memory. That's seen as, chaotic or not focused or not attentive or not smart. And that's not the issue. All of
Mhm.
these pieces are seen as moral issues because our home isn't organized.
Mhm.
That's a moral thing. It's not actually, but that's how society presents it. And so there's a lot of undoing of shame that we have to do as well as finding tools that actually work for us.
Mhm. And I just going kind of back to the tools a little bit. Like I use tools a lot in school to rate my exams, and I was always ashamed to tell people it. I can't even remember what it was called. Like it reads to you.
Mhm.
I don't even know. You put it through a machine thing and it reads it back to you. I don't even know. Like I just know they need to make something better because it was massive. And you would always be told, like you would always see the one person using it. It's like a queen chair. Oh, that person's using it. Um, but I remember being like so embarrassed using it in university because it always, it, for me anyways, it just felt like guilty of like, I'm having something read this to me. Why can't I read it to myself? The true reality of it is that I'm just a slow reader. And so I just need somebody to read it to me because my brain just couldn't keep up with sometimes how slow or fast I'd read
Totally. And I
clearly.
think I mean, some of this definitely falls on the education system and teachers, speaking as a teacher, to frame the way that we talk about tools and resources, right? Like,
Mhm,
what's the point of an exam? It's to figure out what you know and see if
mhm,
you know your stuff. It's not to read. That's not the point of the exam unless it's a reading exam, right?
yes.
And so what's the point? Is
Mhm,
the point to show what you know? In which case, who cares how you do it? That's not the point.
ex
And it doesn't matter if it's being read to you or you're doing it on a video or you're writing it by hand. It doesn't matter. You're
mhm,
showing what you know, and that's the point. Uh,
mhm,
and and I think sharing why we use the tools we do, and
mhm,
that just as we talk about other differences that are visible, whether that be skin color or um, that one comes to my brain the fastest because it's so talked about, or gender differences, or sex differences, or there's all these visible differences that we have, and
mhm,
there's no having different colored skin doesn't make you lesser than or better than. Just because you're a man or a woman doesn't make you lesser than or better than. We've worked on all these areas. What we haven't worked on is equalizing and normalizing brain differences, learning differences,
Mhm.
different operating systems in the brain, and we have to have that same conversation.
Mhm.
Just because your brain works like a Mac doesn't mean you have any better or lesser value than somebody whose brain works like a Windows or
Mhm.
or another operating system. They we each need different supports and structures to thrive, and that should be normalized instead of hidden. And that's my other frustration is tools are often hidden.
Mhm.
Often shamed. Anytime you hide anything, it becomes a shame thing, right? But just
Yeah.
because this student has a different exam, that's hidden because we don't want to point that out. Well,
Mhm.
now we're creating shame around it instead of empowering them with saying like, "Yeah, there's 5 different copies because different people need different things. This kid's gonna get it one page at a time, and this person's gonna get it on a blue paper because that helps their brain read it. This kid's gonna have, it read to them, and this" whatever. When we
Yeah.
normalize tools, we remove the shame.
Mhm. It's so true.
So that's a big push that I have right now is just and then explain the interventions, explain the tools because I was talking with my sister one day and she said, "Were you ever like sat right next to the teacher?" I went like, "Yeah, I I think I was a couple times in certain classes, but, not a ton." And I said, "As a teacher, I know that that's a support for kids with ADHD because the proximity piece and da da." And I went on and explained the situation behind it. And she had a moment, she went, "I never knew they did that to help me. I thought it's because I was a bad kid. I didn't realize that they did that because it was to help me."
Mhm.
And how heartbreaking that a tool that is valid to support kids
Yep.
was seen as something to punish,
Yeah.
something to be ashamed of, and that's the other thing we need to do is we need to just talk about these
Mhm.
tools and how they're just tools.
Mhm.
Moral value, they're just tools.
And that's the big thing, like, a lot of kids or even adults, if these things are not properly talked about, we're just kind of feeling ashamed and not understanding. So the more we educate, and that's the one thing I love to do is I don't like to talk down to anyone. I ask them like, "Oh, like I'm just going use an SOP for an example. An SOP, we need this," and then I educate. Do you need more information? Okay, and then I break it down more. Not just we're doing it this way.
Mhm. Yeah,
Good luck. Like, it's just once you start to build that education awareness on whatever the situation is, the more empowered the person individual will feel.
absolutely.
I'm just looking at the time. I wanna make sure we hit on your toolkit, your registration waitlist. Do you wanna just educate the listeners on this?
Yeah, so I run my courses every September, January, and April,
Mhm.
both for the parent and for the adult course. The adult course is brand new. It will be launching this September. So I don't have, it's not open for registration quite yet. Early August, I will open it, but I do have a wait list if you want more information and want to be informed when registration is opening.
Awesome. Yes. Everyone go to Kendall's website. Oh, I did have it there. Nope, that's your wrong button. There we
There we
go.
go. ADHDtoolkit.com, the ADHDtoolkit.com. Somebody else owns ADHDtoolkit.com and hasn't been
Oh,
willing to sell it to me yet. So
yeah.
I'm working it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show again today and the
Thank you.
other day. And anyone listening and haven't seen, I think it was episode 22 that you were on. No, wait, we're in episode 25. It was episode 16, I believe. So go
There you
back and watch that one. Numbers. Um, please go back and listen to the first one. And I would love to have you back, Kendall, next
go.
year. We're already booked out for 2024. So we're booking to 2025. So
Congratulations. That's so exciting for you. Well done.
we'll definitely have you back next year. So you and I will reconnect on that.
Sounds
Everyone
good.
listening, thank you so much for tuning in to Breaking Norms, Building Dreams. And a big thank you to the United Public Radio Network and UFO Paranormal Radio Network. With that, everyone, please remember your journey is unique and your worth is unquestionable. Thank you.